that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have touched, the word of life.
There's an old story about a tightrope walker that put a rope across Niagara Falls. A crowd gathered. He yelled to the crowd, "Do you believe I can walk across Niagara Falls?" And they yelled, "Yes!" And he did. He then got a wheelbarrow and he said to the crowd, "Do you believe I can push a wheelbarrow across Niagara Falls?" And they yelled, "Yes!" And he did. Finally, he said to the crowd, "Do you believe I can push a person in the wheelbarrow across the falls?" And they yelled, "Yes!" And he said, "Well, then who will be the first to get in?" Now that's what faith is. Faith is not just believing something, it's being willing to get in the wheelbarrow. The book of Habakkuk is about a man who was struggling with his faith. It was written in 607 BC, and it's very different from the other prophets that we've been studying because they were all warning somebody that judgment was coming. Obadiah warned the Edomites that they were going to be doomed because of their pride. Jonah warned Assyria. God had compassion on them. Micah warned Judah. He was like Isaiah, really, except Isaiah was comfortable with kings and Micah was with the common man. Micah's message was that one of God's desire is that we act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Well, we come to Habakkuk, and there's not a book of warning. It's a conversation between Habakkuk and God. Habakkuk has lived during the time of King Josiah. You will recall that Judah has had 20 kings. Only 8 of them were good. Josiah's grandfather, Manasseh, was one of the worst. Remember him? He was a bad guy. His son, Ammon, became king. He reigned a very short time and he was assassinated. And Josiah became king at age 8. He was different from his grandfathers because he had a heart for God. When he was 16, he started to seek God. when he was in his 20s, he made a decree that the temple should be restored. And that's when Hilkiah, the high priest, found the book of the law. Now, can you believe it? They found the book of the law? No wonder there's no faith in the land. They don't even have the word of God. Well, when it is read to King Josiah, he tears his clothes and grieves because he realizes they're not obeying God's law. And he sets out to do something about it. He tears down the false idols, gets rid of the false gods, gets rid of the spiritists, and reinstates Passover. He also says the word has to be read to the people and they have to obey it. Unfortunately, Josiah is killed. And Habakkuk sees this happen too, because not only is the good king killed, but there's a big shift in power. The way that happens is the Assyrians, we've heard about them, they're the ones that have already carted the northern kingdom off, come down and attack Babylon. But Babylon defeats them. Assyria goes back home. Babylon follows them and makes an alliance with the Medes. Now the Medes were a very fierce people that lived northeast of Assyria. The two of them together attack Nineveh and defeat it, just like was predicted by the prophets. The Assyrians flee to the west. Egypt sees how powerful Babylon is becoming. They come up along the coast to come to Assyria's aid. King Josiah goes out to fight the Egyptians. He is killed. Now the good guy's gone. His son Jehoiakim becomes king in his place, and he's too much like his grandfather. All those great religious reforms are gone. Because remember what we've said all along, as the leader goes, so goes the people. Not only are the religious conditions changed, but the political ones have too, because now Assyria is no longer the enemy, the Babylonians are. That's what the situation is when we open up to the book of Habakkuk, and he has a burden. That's what the word oracle means in chapter 1, verse 1. He has a question, and the question is, how long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and wickedness and destruction and strife and contention? And the people aren't obeying the law. It's being ignored, and justice is never upheld. Poor Habakkuk looks around and is very distressed. And his question is, how long are you going to put up with wickedness? I've been praying and praying. Actually, we could rephrase his question, and it really is something like this. Why aren't you doing something, God? Have you ever prayed like that? Especially when you've prayed and prayed, because he says, how long do I have to keep asking? So obviously, he's been doing some praying, and God hasn't been answering. God does answer, though, in verse 5. He says, I am doing something you would not believe if you were told. I kind of had a feeling if at those times when I am whining at God, because I've been praying and he hasn't acted quick enough, if I could just listen a little more carefully, I might hear him say, I am doing something you would not believe if I told you. Isn't that encouraging? Well, the lesson here, and there is a lesson, and that is God may be silent, but he's not sleeping. He goes ahead and tells Habakkuk what he's up to, and he says, I am raising up the Chaldeans, verse 6. Now the Chaldeans were actually a Semitic people that lived in South Babylon. They eventually become a part of the nation of Babylon. They become the leaders. And so eventually the word Chaldean and Babylonian became interchangeable. He says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, and he says, here's what they're like. They are fierce, impetuous. They seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They're dreadful, feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. They are like eagles. They just swoop down and devour. they come for the purpose of violence. They collect captives, they heap up rubble and capture it, but verse 11 ends with, they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. This would be as though God were to come to you this afternoon and say, you know, I know you have these enemies. I know things are not looking good around you, but here's my plan. I'm going to send in a very fierce, mean enemy, and they're going to take your house. And they're going to take everybody else's houses too, and they're also going to kill some people, but some they'll just capture and imprison. And they will burn things. They'll burn down the cities. They'll burn down the infrastructure. What a frightening thought. I mean, put yourself in their place. And Habakkuk is very frightened by this. I mean, it doesn't help too much for him to know that God's going to hold them accountable for what they do. I mean, that's nice. Gosh, what a frightening message this is. So Habakkuk does something that we probably should all remember. He goes back to thinking about the character of God. Look at verse 12. He says, "Are you not from everlasting, O my God, my Holy One?" It's as though he's saying, wait a minute, ooh, I don't like the sound of it, but you are holy. If this is what your plan is, I have to remember you're a holy God. And he says, we will not die. Now, I believe that that is a statement of faith. And let me give you a little, my definition at least, of what faith is. It's in your workbook, and it's there so that you will remember it. In the New Testament, there are 4 verses that describe faith that we will remember by that acronym HBOs. In Romans 10:17, God says faith comes from hearing the Word of God. So first, I have to hear what God says. In Romans 4:20, he says, by faith, Abraham believed God. He just didn't hear him, he believed what God said. Then Hebrews 11:8 says, being strong in faith, when called, Abraham obeyed God. So he not only heard, he believed, and he was willing to get in the wheelbarrow. Hebrews 11:1 says, it's hearing and believing and obeying without seeing the end result. Well, now, this is a statement of faith because Habakkuk is saying we're not all going to die. Now, I'm sure it's not that he really believes that the Chaldeans are going to come in and not kill anybody. He knows better. But what he's saying is God made a promise to David that his kingdom would be everlasting. Therefore, I know we will not all be destroyed. This nation will not end, even though God has just pronounced this great destruction. That's a prayer of faith. He's heard God, and he believes what God says. The second thing he thinks about the character of God is at the end of verse 12, he says, you have appointed them and established them to correct your people. He says, okay, you're holy, and this is your plan. You're going to use these people to correct your people. In verse 13, he says something else. Your eyes are too pure to approve evil or look upon wickedness. I think that's a verse you should memorize. Because how many times have you heard somebody say, I believe God is a God of love, therefore everyone would have to be in heaven because he wouldn't want anybody not to be there. And you can say, you know, that's true. God is a God of love. He showed us how much he loved us in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. But Habakkuk says, he's of too pure eyes to look upon sin. Therefore, there can't be one sin in heaven, or God couldn't be there. He can't look on it. So sin has to be dealt with. It's a very important verse. Habakkuk is saying, I realize we deserve to be punished. But he has a second question. The second question is in verse 13. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up the righteous? Why have you made us like fish and the Chaldeans like fishermen? And the interesting thing is the Chaldeans actually have artwork or antiquities that have pictures of men with hooks through their lips, string together like fish. Or there are pictures of men caught up in a net. Now, the first question he asked was, why aren't you doing something? And his second question is, why are you doing this? Have you ever been there? You see, his question is, why would you use the Chaldeans to judge your people when they're worse than we are? It makes no sense. But God's ways are higher than our ways, aren't they? We learn something real important from Habakkuk on what he does next, because even though he doesn't understand what God is doing, in chapter 2, verse 1, he makes a decision. And the decision is, I will stand on my guard post and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me. He says, I don't understand here, but I'm just going to go up to the watchtower and watch for God to speak. I'll just wait until he says something. And what happens when we get in the Word of God? Faith comes from hearing. So if I hear the Word of God, my faith will be increased. And that's what he decides to do. Well, God does speak to him. In verse 3, he says, the vision is for an appointed time. It may hasten, but it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay. There's a lesson here. God may linger, but he's never late. He says, I told you the Chaldeans are coming to judge. They will. They are. And he then tells a little bit more about the judgment, the difference between people. There's a choice we have to make. Will we be righteous or will we be prideful? He first starts with the proud in verse 4. He says the proud's soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith. Let's think about the righteous first of all. That verse is so important that it is repeated 3 times in the New Testament. It's in the book of Romans. The book of Romans is about how to be righteous, how to become righteous. And he tells us the righteous will live by faith. My friend Ronaldo, that verse changed his life. He was a man who felt that the righteous lived by suffering. He thought you became right with God if you suffered like Jesus suffered. And he would beat himself and cut himself to suffer until he read that verse. The verse says, the righteous shall live by what? Faith. He realized he just had to have faith in what the suffering Jesus already did. That verse is repeated in the book of Galatians. The book of Galatians is about how the righteous live. The righteous shall live. How? By faith. That book, that changed my life because I was one who thought, first of all, that you became righteous and lived righteous by works. I thought I would become righteous. I didn't smoke, drink, or swear, always went to church, have a string of 12 years of Sunday school pins to prove it. I was trying to work my way to righteousness. But even after I put faith in Jesus, that he had done it all, I still tried to live the Christian life by works. I tried very hard to be a Christian. You know, it's hard work to try to be like Jesus. I thought I had to work now that I was a Christian. But Galatians says, the righteous shall live. How? By faith. The book of Hebrews repeats the same verse right before the faith chapter that gives us that long list of people who live by faith. The righteous shall live by faith. But he also tells us about the others, the proud. In verse 5, he says, wine will betray the haughty man. He doesn't stay at home. He has this appetite that he can't fulfill. He gathers to himself nations. He collects people. A proud person is never satisfied, he says. They're always looking for something to fill the void. Look at verse, in the middle of verse 5 there. I thought this was rather sobering. He is like death never satisfied. Like death, never satisfied. It almost gives us the picture of if I die without a relationship with God, I'll spend eternity never satisfied. Wow, that is hell, isn't it? He goes on and he declares woes against the proud man. He says, first of all, a proud man wants things he can't afford, so he gets loans. And that makes him indebted to his creditors. And then a proud man wants things he can't afford, so he cheats or uses evil gain to get them. And then he says in verse 12 that he wants things and he uses bloodshed. Do you see a little progression here? We go from loans to cheating to actually hurting somebody to get what I want. And then in verse 15 he says they get drunk. And they not only do that, but it leads to sexual immorality, which drinking and drugs often do. And then he says in verse 18, we end up with idols. Idols who are speechless, who can't talk. Verse 19, he says, woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise. And that is your teacher. Behold, he said, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside it. I love that because Habakkuk was accusing God of being silent. And then God says, you know, you all have all these idols that you look to for answers, and they're totally speechless. They don't even have any breath in them. Look at the next verse, verse 20. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. It's like he's saying, you accused me of silence. I'm in my temple. It's time for you to be silent. Listen, because faith comes from hearing the word of God. In verse 14 of that chapter, I think this is where Jesus is concealed in this book. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. 2 Corinthians 4:6 says, God has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. In other words, if I want to see the glory of God, where do I look? The face of Jesus. John, in the first chapter of John, said, when we looked at Jesus, we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. He's saying the earth will be, it isn't right now, but it will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God, and that's when Jesus comes. That's the only time we will really see the glory of God and know the glory of God. Well, Habakkuk has moved from the pit of despair up to the watchtower. God has spoken, and the man who had the wavering faith and then the listening faith now has a responding faith. The whole third chapter is a prayer. It's a prayer that he first, in the first two verses, petitions the Lord. And he only has one request. He says, Lord, in your wrath, remember mercy. In other words, I know that you have wrath, and I know that you're going to judge us. I know those Chaldeans are coming, but be merciful. That's his one request, for God's mercy. In verses 3 through 15, it's a prayer of praise. He knows the Chaldeans are coming. It scares him, but he thinks back to all the times and all the ways that God has worked in the past. He goes back in verse 5 to the pestilence and the plagues. Well, of course, that's when they were in Egypt, and God brought them out. God saved them. He goes to the parting of the sea when they came out of the Red Sea and in through the Jordan River. God saved them, brought them into their land. In verse 11, he talks about the sun and the moon standing in its place. That happened in Joshua when the sun stood still. In verse 13, he says, you went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. He's saying to himself and to God, I'm going to think about all the ways you've saved us in the past. Isn't that a great idea when you're praying and God isn't answering your prayers? You're praying and He's answering, but He's not doing what you want Him to. To think back to all the ways He's worked in the past. This is a prayer of praise. And that's an important thing when we're losing faith, because we have to remember God is always faithful, isn't He? The last part of his prayer, though, is a prayer of faith. It starts in verse 16. He says, I heard and my inward parts trembled. At the sound my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. He says, oh, I've heard God speak. I know what's coming. And the very thought of people taking my home and my dog and my children is so distressing. But God said it, and even though it makes me shake, I'm going to stand quietly and wait. Whew. That's faith, isn't it? No more whining, no more complaining. I'm going to stand and wait. This distress is coming. But look at the faith that comes next in verse 17. Though the fig tree should not blossom and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail and the fields produce no fruit, though the flock should be cut off from the fold and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Whoa, this is faith. He says, look, I know that this judgment may mean that I might lose everything. The bank account may go. The savings may go. The house may go. It all may go. Yet, I will exult in the Lord. And that word exult means jump for joy. I'm going to jump for joy regardless of my circumstances, is what he's saying. I'm going to trust God regardless of my circumstances. And because his faith is increased now, he's heard God speak, he believes what God says, he ends with verse 19, because I know his character, because I know what his past conduct, the Lord will be my strength, number one, and he has made my feet like hinds' feet. I've read that a hind is a female deer, and their feet are more sure or steady than a male deer. So God is saying he will make our feet sure, even when these difficult things come. And Habakkuk ends by saying, he makes me walk on high places. This man has gone from the pit of distress to the watchtower to listen to what God has to say, wait for him to speak, and then on up to high places in the Lord. Does God always do things the way you expect? Does he answer your prayers just like that? Have you ever had a time when your faith has wavered? We can learn from this, can't we? When we haven't heard God speak, faith comes from hearing. Let us go up to the watchtower and wait for God to speak. And he will. And then let us learn, because of his past actions and his character, that we can trust him regardless of the circumstances. You see, the lesson here has been Habakkuk may have been in distress, but he was not distressed. He was in distress, but he was not distressed. I think it's important for us to remember that old saying, and I think this is what Habakkuk did. You look around, you'll be distressed. Look within, you'll be depressed. But look above, see his face, and be at rest.
Even when life doesn't work out as we have planned, we have found that God is still working his plan. The 90s were a concentrated time of God changing our plans testing our faith in Him and giving us lots of grace. In the 90s, our youngest son tested our faith in God's plan too. He was born later in our family and was a lot of fun and brought a lot of laughs to our family. We thought after raising 2 children that were 14 and 12 when he was born that we would know how to raise this 3rd child. But at 16, he decided he wanted to experiment with the world and turned his back on God. We waited and we worried and we watched and we prayed that God would do whatever it took to get his attention and to show him the deceitfulness of the world. And God answered our prayers. After 4 years of drug involvement, he was arrested and put in jail. I really felt guilty at first, and we looked back over our parenting with him on what we did wrong, what we could have done differently. And I'm sure we didn't do it perfectly, but in the end it was his choice. And in the end it was God's way of dealing with him to make his faith his own. In the jail cell, he found God again, and God found him and started his spiritual recovery first. Today, God has graced him with a godly wife and a cute little boy. And I wonder about the bumpy and dangerous detour that was on the highway of his life. But God has taught me that he is not only growing up children in his nursery, but he's growing up their parents. He was teaching us about prayer when that was all that we could do. He was teaching about his faithfulness when we were helpless. And he was teaching us that his timing is perfect. In Habakkuk, God says, I may tarry, but I'm never late. In 1995, our oldest grandson, who was 7 at the time, was hit in the head by a falling tree limb and sustained a severe brain injury and almost died. We walked into the emergency room, and Chip was covered in blood because blood had gushed out of Will's ear after he had been hit. And he hadn't even had time to change or get cleaned up. The call went out to our church, and people started praying and coming down to the hospital. The first time he wiggled his toe, we were thrilled. And then he started to respond when we'd ask him to lift his leg or move his finger. And even though he was in a coma, he could respond to what he heard. Now he is making progress with special classes and loving teachers, but only God knows what will happen in his future. In 1999, my husband's job description changed dramatically. He was the senior pastor and founding pastor of a church in Georgia, and had been in that position for 20 years. At that time, his job description changed, and he became one of the associate pastors. This was a big change for him, not to feel the leadership on his shoulders, not to know the direction that the church was going to go. I felt very helpless because there was nothing I could do to change the pain, to fix it, to convince him that he was still worthy and worthwhile. He just had to struggle with that himself, with God. And he had a strong belief in God's sovereignty, but how that played out day by day, it was hard. It was real hard to watch. So what God opened up was that he got to spend more time studying, and more in-depth studying, because he wasn't having to deal with the leadership problems. And as a result, he's enjoyed, I think, these last 3 years even more, being able to study and to teach and to just work on being more than doing. Frankly, I see that my plans are usually pretty short-sighted and lean toward comfort and pleasure, where God's plans are more long-range into eternity, and he has for his goal my Christ-likeness and his glory. And I need to keep my faith centered on God, because he is my rock. He's the rock of all wisdom and all love and all power and all holiness. And as God says in Habakkuk, I want my righteous ones to live by faith in me.